I adjusted my glasses and looked down at the hand-lettered place card, my name spelled with a careless extra E that my sister Briar had been correcting since we were children. I was sitting at table 14, tucked so deep into the shadow of the venue's indoor weeping willow that the fake leaves occasionally brushed the back of my neck. To my left was a group of 20-somethings from Briar's new corporate marketing firm, complaining loudly about the lack of top-shelf gin. To my right was an empty chair reserved for someone, plus one who hadn't bothered to show. Across the room, bathed in the soft, expensive glow of the fairy lights I had paid for, Briar was laughing, her hand resting on her new husband's shoulder. I had signed the final wire transfer of $14,000 to this exact catering company 3 days ago, yet here I was, buried behind her casual acquaintances. It wasn't just an oversight, it was a calculation. I could see it in the way my stepmother, Celia, avoided looking toward the back corner of the room whenever she adjusted her silk shawl. When the invitation had arrived 3 months ago, blank and sterile, I told myself that Briar was just overwhelmed. She was 24, marrying into a family that owned 3 dry-cleaning franchises and wore pastel linen to casual dinners. I was 31, a quiet accountant who still lived in our hometown, managing the lingering debts our father had left behind before his stroke. "Are you with the firm?" the girl next to me asked, chewing on an olive. Her badge said Chloe. She didn't look at me, her eyes scanning the room for the next tray of appetizers. "No," I said, my voice swallowed by the acoustic echo of the high ceilings. "I'm Briar's sister, Maeve." Chloe paused, her fork hovering over her plate. She looked at my simple, dark navy dress, the one Celia had told me was perfectly modest for the background, and then looked toward the head table where Briar's bridesmaids were draped in custom champagne silk. "Oh," she said, an awkward, tight little smile forming on her lips. "I didn't know she had a sister. She always talks about her brother-in-law's family." The words didn't sting as much as they solidified something cold and heavy in my chest. The silence at table 14 grew louder as the first course was served. I looked at the menu card, embossed with gold foil that cost 80 cents apiece, another detail I had approved over the phone while sitting in my cramped office, rubbing my temples. My father was home with a temporary nurse tonight, a cost I had also covered so Celia and Briar could have their perfect, unburdened day. As the music shifted to a low, instrumental waltz, Celia finally made her way toward the back tables. She didn't look like a woman who had spent the last 6 months weeping on my kitchen phone about flower deposits. She looked radiant, her skin plumped from a spa day I knew hadn't been in her personal budget. She stopped by table 14, her hand lightly touching Chloe's shoulder with the easy familiarity of someone who belonged. Then, her eyes drifted down to me. "Maeve, sweetheart," Celia murmured, leaning down so only I could hear her over the clinking of silverware. Her breath smelled of expensive champagne. "You don't mind the seat, do you? Briar's boss needed to be close to the front for networking, and we just ran out of room at the family table. You understand how important this quarter is for her career." I looked at the silver fork in my hand, noticing a tiny water spot near the tine. "The family table has 10 seats, Celia," I said softly, not looking up. "There are 8 people sitting there." Celia's hand tightened slightly on the back of my chair, the fabric bunching under her fingers. Her voice dropped its warmth, returning to the sharp, transactional tone she usually reserved for our monthly budget arguments. "Don't do this tonight, Maeve. After everything we've done to make this day beautiful, don't ruin it with your jealousy." Celia moved away before I could answer, her silk shawl swirling like smoke as she glided back toward the light. I watched her go, my thumb tracing the rough, unpolished edge of the table beneath the tablecloth. Jealousy. It was the word they always used whenever I asked for a receipt, or when I suggested that 24 varieties of imported roses might be a luxury we couldn't afford while Dad's medical equipment was on a monthly lease. To Celia and Briar, my practicality was a disease, a bitter symptom of being the plain, unmarried older sister who dealt in numbers instead of dreams. The marketing group next to me had moved on from the gin to discussing their commission structures. Chloe was leaning across the table, her laughter sharp and performative, designed to carry over the ambient noise of the room. None of them looked at me. To them, I was just a placeholder, a gray shape filling a necessary gap in the seating chart. I reached into my small evening bag and pulled out my phone, intending to check on Dad. There was a text from Mrs. Gable, the night nurse. "Your father ate half his broth. He's resting now. Kept asking if Briar looked beautiful." A lump formed in my throat, thick and dry. I didn't reply. I couldn't. I looked up and caught Briar's eye across the expanse of the room. She was standing by the champagne tower, her veil pinned back, revealing the diamond drop earrings Celia had insisted were an absolute necessity for the photos. Briar saw me. She froze for a fraction of a second, her smile faltering at the edges, her gaze dropping to table 14. For a brief moment, I thought I saw a flicker of shame in her eyes. The same look she used to give me when we were teenagers, and I caught her wearing my clothes without asking. But then her new husband, Julian, leaned down to whisper something in her ear, his hand sliding around her waist, and the look vanished. She laughed, a bright, chiming sound that reached all the way to my dark corner, and turned her back to me. The main course arrived. It was a delicate braised beef brisket with a red wine reduction. I recognized it immediately from the invoice. It was $72 per plate. I picked up my knife, but my hand was trembling slightly, so I set it back down. The young man sitting opposite Chloe, a guy with a sharp haircut named Brandon, glanced at my untouched plate and then at me. "Not hungry?" he asked, his tone friendly but detached. "Just packing myself," I said smoothly, forcing my face into the neutral, pleasant mask I used when dealing with difficult clients at the firm. "Fair enough," Brandon said, turning back to Chloe. "Hey, did you see the car Julian's parents got them? A brand new crossover. Must be nice to have family that actually supports your future." Chloe nodded fervently. "Right. Briar always says she had to build everything herself from scratch, so she really appreciates the stability now." The silver fork in my hand suddenly felt incredibly heavy. From scratch. I thought of the $5,000 I had taken out of my own retirement savings last winter to cover Briar's final semester of tuition when her grant fell through. I thought of the countless weekends I spent coding her portfolio website while she sat on my couch, crying about how hard the industry was. The speeches started shortly after. Julian's father stood up first, a boisterous man whose voice boomed through the microphone. He spoke of legacy, of welcoming Briar into a family of builders and doers. He thanked everyone for coming, specifically mentioning his colleagues from the country club and the local business alliance. Then it was Celia's turn. She walked up to the podium, adjusting the microphone with a delicate, practiced grace. She looked out over the room, her eyes lingering on the head table, then on Julian's family, completely bypassing table 14. "When my husband fell ill," Celia began, her voice cracking slightly with a beautifully timed hint of emotion, "we weren't sure how we would navigate the future. But Briar, my beautiful, resilient girl, never lost her joy. She kept this family's spirit alive. She worked so hard to ensure that today could happen, sacrificing so much of her own young life to keep us afloat." A soft, collective awe rippled through the room. Chloe clapped her hands together, her eyes shining. I sat perfectly still, the fake willow leaves brushing against my hair, watching my stepmother rewrite history in front of 200 people using the words I had bought for them. The applause swelled, cascading through the high-ceilinged room like waves on a rocky shore. At table 14, Brandon and Chloe were nodding in synchronization, deeply moved by the narrative of the self-made, sacrificial bride. I reached down, my fingers brushing the cool silk of my navy dress, feeling the sharp edge of my phone through the thin fabric of my purse. I wanted to pull it out. I wanted to look at the spreadsheets. The itemized deductions, the ledger of my life that proved every single word coming out of Celia's mouth was a lie. But I didn't move. I kept my hands folded in my lap, a quiet statue in the dark. When Celia stepped down from the podium, she bypassed the aisle entirely, heading straight to Julian's parents to receive their comforting hugs. Briar was dabbing at the corner of her eye with a lace handkerchief, the one I had spent 3 hours bleaching and pressing the night before because Celia said old family heirlooms needed proper care. "She's so strong," Chloe murmured to Brandon, her voice thick with second-hand emotion. "To handle a sick parent and still launch a career, I can barely manage my inbox. Some people just have that drive, Brandon replied, cutting into his brisket. You can tell she didn't have anyone handing things to her on a silver platter. I let out a breath, a short, silent puff of air that barely stirred the candle flame in front of me. The waiter arrived a moment later, silently clearing my untouched plate. He looked at me with a flicker of professional sympathy, noticing the full portion of $72 beef heading back to the kitchen trash. I gave him a small, grateful nod. He was the only person in the room who had truly looked at me all evening. The band started up again, transitioning into a lively, upbeat jazz standard to clear the heavy emotional air. The dance floor filled quickly, a sea of pastel linen and custom champagne silk spinning under the fairy lights. I stood up, my knees slightly stiff from sitting in the cramped corner. Nobody at table 14 noticed my departure. Chloe was already taking a selfie with Brandon, their heads tilted together to capture the perfect angle of the head table in the background. I slipped through the shadows, weaving past the busier tables near the bar, and stepped out through the heavy double doors into the venue's courtyard. The night air was cool, smelling of damp earth and boxwood hedges. It was a relief after the suffocating scent of lilies and expensive perfume inside. I walked down the stone path until the music became a muffled thrumming behind me, stopping by a small stone fountain that trickled water into a mossy basin. Maeve. I turned. Briar was standing at the edge of the patio, holding the train of her dress up out of the dirt. Without the theatrical lighting of the ballroom, she looked smaller, younger, and incredibly tired. The perfection of her bridal glow was beginning to crack under the weight of the humidity. "You left during the toasts," she said, her voice missing the bright, musical lilt she had been using with Julian's family. It was her defensive voice, the one she used when she knew she was in the wrong but refused to back down. "I needed some air," I said quietly, leaning back against the stone rim of the fountain. The willow leaves at table 14 were getting a bit crowded. Briar flinched, a tiny movement of her shoulders before her jaw set into a hard, stubborn line. "Look, I know you're upset about the seating, but Celia explained it to you, didn't she? Julian's father's partners came at the last minute. We had to accommodate them. It's about formatting a network for our future, Maeve. You understand business." "I understand numbers, Briar," I said, my voice flat, completely devoid of the anger she was likely preparing to fight. "And the numbers don't add up. I paid for the chairs those partners are sitting in. I paid for the steak they're eating. And I paid for the dress you're wearing while you tell me I don't belong at your family table." Briar let go of her dress. The heavy champagne silk dropped into the damp dirt of the courtyard path, absorbing a dark stain at the hem, but she didn't seem to notice. She looked at me, her chest rising and falling with a sharp, shallow breath. For a second, the anger in her eyes looked like hatred, but it was just the panic of someone whose clean, pretty reality had been smudged. "Is that what this is about?" she whispered, her voice hissed and tight, cast toward the ballroom doors to ensure no one was listening. "The money. You're going to bring up the money tonight, Maeve, on my wedding day." "I didn't bring it up," I said, my hands remaining resting loosely against the cool stone of the fountain. "Celia did, in her speech. She told 200 people how hard you worked to make tonight happen. She told them how much you sacrificed." "I did sacrifice." Briar's voice cracked, a desperate little sound. She stepped closer, the smell of her expensive, citrusy perfume mixing with the damp earth. "Do you think it was easy for me to live in that house while Dad was deteriorating? Do you think I liked watching you handle everything, feeling like a ghost in my own family because you had to be the responsible one? I had to get out, Maeve. I had to build a life where everything wasn't about illness and debt and gray walls." I looked at her face, truly looked at it under the dim, external security lights of the venue. The freckles on her nose that she'd tried so hard to conceal with heavy foundation were still visible. She was terrified. Not of me, but of the possibility that the life she was launching tonight, the pastel linen, the dry-cleaning franchises, the pristine future, was built on a foundation she didn't own. "You didn't get out by building, Briar," I said softly, the lack of heat in my voice seeming to unnerve her more than a shout would have. "You got out because I paid the toll." She opened her mouth to argue, her lips parting to deliver one of the sharp, defensive scripts Celia had spent years teaching her. but the heavy glass doors of the venue swung open. Julian stepped out into the courtyard, a glass of bourbon in his hand, his collar slightly loosened. "Briar, babe, there you are. The photographer is looking for us for the sparkler exit. Your mom says we need to move before the older guests start heading out." He stopped, his gaze shifting between us, noticing the heavy silence hanging over the fountain. He looked at me, his smile turning slightly formal, the polite, distant expression reserved for his wife's quiet relative. "Oh, hey, Maeve. Everything okay out here?" Briar instantly shifted. The tension in her shoulders vanished, replaced by that bright, fluid grace I had watched her practice in front of mirrors since she was a child. She stepped back toward him, her hand slipping naturally into his arm. "Everything's fine, sweetheart," she said, her voice dropping back into its lovely musical cadence. "Maeve and I were just having a moment. Family stuff." Julian nodded, entirely satisfied, and pulled her a little closer. "Great. Well, we need to head inside. Come on, Maeve, you should come watch the exit. It's going to look amazing in the video." "I'll be right in," I said, giving him a small, polite nod. Briar didn't look back at me as he led her away. She held her head high, her champagne train dragging through the dirt, moving back toward the bright, artificial light of the ballroom. I stayed by the fountain for another 5 minutes, listening to the muffled sound of the coordinator instructing the guests on how to hold the sparklers. Then, I walked back inside, bypassed the ballroom entirely, and walked into the empty lobby where my coat was hanging in the cloakroom. As I pulled my car keys from my purse, my fingers brushed against a small, folded piece of paper I had forgotten was there. It was the copy of the final catering invoice I had printed out that morning to verify the wire transfer. I opened it, looking at the total at the bottom, then turned it over. Using a pen from the registration desk, I wrote a short note on the back. Then, I walked over to the gift table, which was overflowing with silver-wrapped boxes and cards, and slid the paper into a heavy, gold-embossed envelope addressed to the newlyweds. The drive back to our neighborhood was entirely quiet, save for the rhythmic click of my turn signal at the empty intersections. The town was asleep, draped in that heavy midnight stillness where everything looks gray and indistinguishable. I parked my 10-year-old sedan in the driveway of the house I still shared with my father, staring at the peeling white paint on the garage door before I turned off the ignition. Inside, the house smelled of menthol rub, boiled broth, and old upholstery, the permanent scent of a life shrunk down to the radius of a medical bed. Mrs. Gable was sitting in the living room under the low glow of a single brass lamp, knitting a sleeve of something green. She looked up as I locked the front door behind me, her eyes automatically dropping to my navy dress, then up to my face. "You're home early, Maeve," she whispered, setting her needles down in her lap. "I thought the reception went until midnight." "I had an early morning tomorrow," I said, slipping off my heels. My feet throbbed a dull, aching reminder of the hours spent standing in the background. "How is he?" "Quiet. He had a brief spell of confusion around 9, kept looking at the door, thinking Briar was going to walk through in her dress. But I gave him his medication, and he settled down. He's been sleeping soundly since." I walked down the narrow, dimly lit hallway to my father's room. The door was cracked open, a sliver of amber light falling across the worn carpet. I stepped inside, the floorboards groaning softly under my weight. My father looked so small beneath the heavy patchwork quilt. His right side, the side the stroke had stolen 4 years ago, was tucked rigidly against his torso. His face was relaxed in sleep, the deep lines around his mouth smoothed out by exhaustion. On his nightstand, next to a plastic cup with a bendy straw, sat a framed photograph of Briar and me from a high school graduation. She was beaming, her arms wrapped around his neck, while I stood slightly to the side, holding her diploma case so she wouldn't drop it. I reached out, my fingers gently brushing a stray lock of gray hair from his forehead. He didn't stir. "She looked beautiful, Dad," I murmured into the silence of the room. The lights were exactly what she wanted. I left his room and paid Mrs. Gable, adding a $20 tip for the late hour, though it made a noticeable dent in my remaining weekly cash budget. After she left, the silence of the house settled over me like a heavy wool blanket. I didn't change out of my dress. Instead, I went into the small spare room that served as my office, turning on the ancient desktop computer that hummed loudly as it booted up. I opened my personal accounting software, looking at the column of numbers that represented my life. There was the $14,000 wire transfer from 3 days ago. There was the $5,000 for tuition. There was the $900 for the photographer's deposit that Celia had forgotten to mention until the week before the wedding. My hand moved to the mouse, clicking open a secondary spreadsheet, the one labeled Estate Management. It contained the itemized list of the remaining debts my father owed, balanced against the meager equity left in this house. For years, I had been stretching every dollar, skipping meals, buying second-hand clothes, and working 60-hour weeks at the firm to ensure that we didn't lose the roof over Dad's head while Celia and Briar lived in a world of endless wants. I clicked on the master file for the joint account I shared with Celia, the one I kept funded strictly for Dad's medical emergencies. My eyes narrowed. There was a pending transaction from 6 hours ago, timed exactly during the cocktail hour of the wedding. It was a withdrawal of $1,200, labeled simply, miscellaneous vendor gratuity. I stared at the screen, my face illuminated by the cold blue light of the monitor. Celia hadn't just put me at table 14. She had used my emergency medical fund to tip the bartenders who were currently serving top-shelf gin to Briar's coworkers. The cold blue glow of the monitor seemed to freeze the air in the room. I didn't yell. I didn't slam my hand on the desk. When you spend years staring at balances that don't match, you learn that anger is an expensive luxury that changes absolutely nothing on a ledger. Instead, I reached for the desk phone and dialed Celia's cell. It went straight to voicemail, the festive, upbeat greeting she'd recorded 2 years ago when she still thought she could project the image of a wealthy, unburdened matriarch. "Celia," I said into the beep, my voice level, hollowed out of any emotion. "You took $1,200 from the medical care account at 6:30 p.m. That money was specifically earmarked for Dad's physical therapy assessment on Tuesday. Reverse the transfer tonight, or I will freeze the account by 8:00 a.m. I hung up, the plastic receiver clicking into place with a definitive snap. I sat there in the dark office, my navy dress tightening against my ribs as I breathed. I knew exactly how tomorrow would play out. Celia would call me at dawn, her voice thick with performative tears, accusing me of trying to tarnish Briar's first morning as a wife. She would say the caterer demanded a cash-equivalent tip for the staff, that Julian's family was watching, that she couldn't humiliate them by looking broke. She would promise to pay it back as soon as the wedding gifts were processed. But the wedding gifts weren't going to save her, not this time. I opened a blank text document on my computer. For 3 years, I had kept a meticulous, hidden log of every single cent that had left my personal accounts to fund Celia's lifestyle and Briar's ambitions. Every emergency, car repair that turned out to be a spa weekend. Every utility bill I covered because Celia miscalculated her alimony remainder. I began to format it. I didn't add any emotional commentary. I didn't write about how it felt to sit behind table 14 or how it felt to watch my sister drag a $14,000 dress through the mud. I simply created 3 distinct columns: date, amount, purpose. By 3:00 a.m., the total at the bottom of the page was $43,620. That didn't even include the tuition or the regular monthly groceries I brought into this house. It was just the favors. A soft chime interrupted the silence. I looked down at my phone. It was a text from Briar. "Maeve, what did you leave in our card box? Julian's mom was helping us sort the envelopes at the hotel, and she saw the paper you put in there. She asked me what it meant. Why are you doing this to me?" I picked up the phone, my fingers steady on the glass screen. I didn't type a long, defensive paragraph. I just thought of the note I had written on the back of that catering invoice, the one that clearly showed my name as the sole guarantor and paying party for the entire event, right underneath the bold gold lettering of her new last name. I replied, "It means the reception is paid for, Briar. Sleep well." I set the phone face down on the desk. The house was silent again, save for the distant, rhythmic hum of my father's oxygen concentrator down the hall. I looked back at the spreadsheet on my monitor, the cursor blinking patiently at the end of the $43,000 balance. For years, I had played the role they assigned me, the reliable, invisible pillar supporting their beautiful, fragile structure. But pillars can choose what they hold up. And tomorrow morning, the weight was going to shift. The sun hadn't even cleared the horizon when my phone began to vibrate against the wooden desk. The caller ID showed Celia's name, accompanied by a picture of her smiling at a garden party 3 summers ago. I let it ring. It vibrated its way across the dust-filmed surface until it fell silent, only to start up again 3 seconds later. On the 5th consecutive call, I picked it up. I didn't say hello. "Maeve, how could you?" Celia's voice was a frantic, ragged whisper, likely delivered from the bathroom of her house so she wouldn't wake whatever house guests she had staying over. "Briar has been up since 4 a.m. crying her eyes out. Julian's mother spent the night dropping passive-aggressive hints about family arrangements and financial transparency. You humiliated her. You gave her a bill as a wedding present." "It wasn't a bill, Celia," I said, leaning back in my chair and looking out the window at the gray, early morning fog. "It was a receipt that had my signature on the bottom line. If Briar is humiliated that her new in-laws know who actually financed her fairy tale, that's an issue between her and her conscience." "You are a cold, bitter girl," Celia hissed, her performative tears instantly hardening into pure venom. "You've always resented her. You couldn't handle the fact that she was the one getting married, that she was the one moving into a beautiful life while you're stuck in that dead-end house." "I am stuck in this house because someone has to make sure Dad doesn't choke on his own saliva while you're out buying silk shawls," I said, my voice dropping an octave, completely steady. "Let's talk about the $1,200, Celia. Did you reverse the transfer?" A sharp pause on the line. I could hear her shallow, angry breathing. "It was an emergency, Maeve. The venue coordinator said the bartenders would shut down early if—" "You took money meant for your paralyzed husband's physical therapy to keep the alcohol flowing for people who don't even know my name," I interrupted. "The bank opens in 2 hours. I've already drafted the paperwork to remove your name from the joint care account entirely. From now on, every single dollar of Dad's pension goes directly to Mrs. Gable and the medical supply company. You won't see a dime of it." "You can't do that," she gasped. "I am his wife." "And I am his legal conservator," I reminded her, a fact she often chose to forget because the legal paperwork had been signed in a sterile hospital room while she was out shopping for comfort clothes. "You have until 8 a.m. to deposit that $1,200 back into the account out of your own pocket. If it's not there, I'm sending the itemized spreadsheet of the $43,000 you owe me to Julian's father." I'm sure a man who owns 3 dry-cleaning franchises would be very interested to see the true credit history of his new daughter's family. "You wouldn't," she whispered, the panic finally breaking through her anger. "Try me," I said and hung up. My hands were cold, but they weren't shaking. I stood up, walked down the hall, and checked on Dad. He was awake, staring blankly at the ceiling, his good hand weakly picking at the edge of the patchwork quilt. "Morning, Dad," I said gently, sitting on the edge of his mattress. I took his stiff, unmoving right hand in mine and rubbed it to bring back the warmth. "The weather's going to clear up today. I think we'll sit by the window later." He made a low, guttering sound in his throat, the closest he could get to a sentence these days. His eyes moved past me, looking toward the door, still searching for the daughter who hadn't visited him in 3 weeks because she was too stressed about the seating charts. "She's happy, Dad," I told him, the lie tasting like ash in my mouth, but it was a kindness he deserved. "She got exactly what she paid for." By 8:05 a.m., I was sitting at the small kitchen table with a mug of black coffee, watching the online banking portal refresh on my phone. The screen flickered, the pending status cleared, and a new entry appeared. A deposit of $1,200, marked as a personal mobile transfer from Celia. She had found the money. She always found it when the alternative meant looking bad in front of people who mattered to her. My phone didn't ring again for the rest of the morning. The silence that followed was heavy, almost physical, settling into the corners of the kitchen like dust. I knew what the silence meant. It was the sound of a family drawing its borders, locking me out on the other side of the fence now that my utility had expired. To Celia and Briar, I was no longer just the boring, dependable older sister. I was a threat. Around noon, a sleek white crossover vehicle pulled up to the curb outside our house. I watched from the living room window as the passenger side door opened and Briar stepped out. She wasn't wearing her champagne silk today. She was in an oversized cashmere sweater and designer sunglasses, her hair tied back in a messy, deliberate bun. Julian stayed in the driver's seat, the engine idling, his eyes fixed firmly on his phone. He didn't look at our house once. Briar didn't use her key. She knocked on the front door, 3 sharp, hesitant raps that sounded completely foreign on the old wood. I opened it, holding a dish towel in one hand. We stood on the porch, the cool afternoon breeze stirring the dead leaves in the gutters. She took off her sunglasses, revealing eyes that were red-rimmed and hollowed out from a long night of arguments. "Julian is waiting in the car," she said, her voice small, stripped of all its theatrical warmth. "We're leaving for our honeymoon in 2 hours." "Have a safe flight," I said quietly, leaning against the doorframe. She swallowed hard, her jaw tightening as she looked past me into the dim, familiar hallway of the house she had fled. "Julian's parents are calling off the down payment assistance they promised us for the townhouse," she whispered, her voice trembling with a mixture of rage and grief. "His mother told Julian that if my family has undisclosed financial complications, they need to reevaluate their investment. Is that what you wanted, Maeve? To ruin my life before it even starts?" "I didn't tell them anything, Briar," I said, my voice matching the flat, unyielding tone of the gray concrete steps beneath her feet. "I gave you a piece of paper showing what I spent. If your new family thinks less of you because they found out you come from a family that relies on my charity, that is a problem with their values, not my timing." Briar stepped closer, her expensive leather flats clicking against the wood of the porch. "You think you're so holy, don't you? Sitting here in the dark, playing the martyr while the rest of us try to actually live. You chose this, Maeve. You chose to stay here and handle Dad. Nobody forced you to pay for my tuition or my wedding. You did it so you could keep a tab on us. You did it so you could feel superior." The words should have cut, but they didn't quite reach the skin. I looked at my younger sister, the girl whose scraped knees I used to bandage, the girl whose secret credit card debts I had quietly absorbed 3 years ago so Dad wouldn't find out before his stroke. "I did it because I loved you," I said softly, the past tense hanging in the air between us like stone. "But you're right about one thing. I kept a tab, and the tab is officially closed." Briar stared at me, her mouth slightly open, as if she were waiting for the rest of a sentence that was never going to come. She was so used to our old rhythm, her pushing a boundary, me sighing, and then both of us moving on while I quietly cleaned up the mess. The realization that I was genuinely done, that the reservoir of my compliance had completely run dry, made her look older than 24. "Fine," she whispered, her voice cracking as she stepped backward down the first porch step. "If that's how you want to be, just don't call me when you change your mind." "I won't," I said. She turned and walked down the cracked concrete path, her cashmere sweater swallowing her posture. She didn't look back. Julian didn't get out to help her. He just leaned over to open the passenger door from the inside. The sleek white crossover pulled away from the curb with a smooth, quiet purr, disappearing around the corner of our street without a backward glance. I closed the heavy front door, the click of the latch echoing through the empty hallway. For the next 3 days, the house was entirely silent. No frantic calls from Celia about unpaid floral balances. No texts from Briar sending screenshots of $500 bridal shoes with a string of pleading emojis. The sudden absence of their chaos felt like the quiet that follows a heavy snowstorm, muffled, sterile, and intensely lonely, but peaceful in a way I hadn't experienced in years. On Tuesday morning, Dr. Harrison arrived for Dad's physical therapy assessment. He was an older man with kind, tired eyes and a leather medical bag that looked as worn as our living room carpet. I stood by the door, watching as he gently manipulated Dad's rigid right arm, checking the resistance in his joints. "He's maintaining his flexibility well, Maeve," Dr. Harrison said, looking up over his half-moon spectacles. You've been doing the daily exercises with him exactly as I asked. Most families rely entirely on the nurses, but your touch makes a difference. I try, I said, leaning against the doorframe, my arms crossed tightly over my chest. I heard the wedding went off beautifully over the weekend, he continued, adjusting Dad's pillow. Celia mentioned it to me a few weeks ago at the pharmacy. She must be thrilled to see Briar settled. It was exactly what they wanted, I replied, keeping my voice perfectly neutral. Dr. Harrison glanced at me, his sharp medical gaze lingering on the dark circles under my eyes before he began packing his instruments. And what about you, Maeve? When was the last time you took a weekend off? A real one away from this house? I don't really have the budget for a vacation right now, Doctor, I said with a small, self-deprecating smile. He clipped his bag shut with a metallic snap. I'm not talking about an expensive trip. I'm talking about breathing room. You've been carrying this entire household on your back since the day your father fell. You're 31. You need to make sure you have a life left to live when the caregiving is over. After he left, I walked out to the kitchen to prepare Dad's lunch. As I chopped carrots for his broth, my phone buzzed on the counter. It was an email notification from my bank. I wiped my hands on the dish towel and picked it up, expecting another automated balance alert. Instead, it was an official notification that a new external account had been linked to my primary checkings. A deposit of exactly $2,000 was sitting and pending, originating from an account under the name Julian Vance. Attached was a brief, automated bank memo that read, "First installment for wedding expenses. Will transfer monthly." I stared at the screen, a slow, cold realization dawning on me. Briar hadn't told Julian the truth. But Julian's mother had clearly forced his hand. They weren't paying me back out of guilt or gratitude. They were paying me to keep my spreadsheets away from their family name. It was hush money, disguised as a payment plan. I stared at the pending transaction notification for a long time, the kitchen knife still slick with carrot juice in my right hand. Julian's family wasn't foolish. They had built a local empire on reputation, on the pristine image of their dry-cleaning storefronts and their flawless country club memberships. They understood that an unvouched debt was a leak in the boat. By transforming my $43,000 of silent sacrifices into an official, monthly business transaction, they were buying my silence. They were making sure I stayed exactly where they wanted me, a paid-off vendor, tucked safely out of sight. $2,000, I whispered to the empty kitchen. It was more than I earned in a 2-week cycle at the accounting firm. It was enough to cover Dad's premium medical supplies, Mrs. Gable's weekend rates, and the overdue repair on our water heater without me having to check my balance 3 times in the grocery line. I hit the accept button. I didn't feel cheap. I didn't feel vindicated. I just felt the cold, clinical satisfaction of a ledger balancing itself out after years of bleeding red. If they wanted to treat our family dynamic like a corporate contract, I was more than qualified to enforce the terms. Later that evening, while Dad was watching an old game show on the small television at the foot of his bed, the front door clicked open. It wasn't the tentative, nervous knock Briar had used. It was the heavy, aggressive swing of someone who still believed they owned the place. Celia walked into the living room, her face tight, her expensive leather handbag slung over her arm like a weapon. She didn't look at me as she dropped it onto the sofa. She walked straight past the kitchen, stopping at the threshold of Dad's bedroom. She looked at him for a single, detached second, the way someone looks at a piece of furniture they intend to sell, before turning her sharp gaze toward me. "You forced Julian's mother to step in," she said, her voice dropping into that venomous whisper she used when she didn't want the neighbors to hear her crack. "Do you have any idea what you've done? She went into their marriage account, pulled Julian's name off their joint savings, and told them they have to pay you back before they can even think about buying a house. Briar is spending her honeymoon in a hotel room crying because her mother-in-law treats her like a liability." "Briar is a liability, Celia," I said, leaning against the kitchen counter, my arms crossed. "And so are you. The only difference is that Julian's family actually looks at the balance sheet before they sign their names." Celia stepped closer, her perfume, something heavy and floral that smelled like a funeral home, filling the small hallway. You think you've won, don't you? You think because you have the bank accounts and the legal guardianship, you control this family. But look around you, Maeve. Who do you have? You have a sick man who can't speak, an empty house, and a pile of numbers. You're going to die in this room, completely alone, because nobody can stand the sight of your ledger. The words were designed to pierce the softest parts of me, the parts that had spent my 20s watching my peers move out, fall in love, and build lives while I stayed behind to change linens and calculate medicine doses. I looked at her, truly looked at the desperate, angry lines around her eyes. She was terrified because for the first time in her life, her beauty and her tears weren't enough to pay her way out of a corner. I might be alone, Celia, I said, my voice dropping into a quiet, rhythmic calm that seemed to make her flinch. But everything in this room belongs to me, and tomorrow morning I'm changing the locks.